Hey everybody, welcome to Crackpot, the podcast where each and every week we dive into a different conspiracy theory and we discuss the merits or the demerits of each. We're your hosts, I'm Tim.
And I'm Zach. Tim, welcome back.
Well, thank you.
It's another week.
It is. I'm excited for this one.
Good.
You pulled out the topic and I was like, are we... oh yeah, so there it is.
I should say, we've been referring to this as Ancient Aliens.
We have.
Which it's not technically the title of the show. It actually should be Chariots of the Gods and Eric Von Daniken. But, of course, what is he most known for and what is this book basically about?
Ancient Aliens.
Nailed it.
Which is what we've been talking about, and the whole way over, I'm like, okay, man, I haven't even seen like a full episode of that show, so I don't really know what I can bring to the table here.
You don't need to really bring anything because the idea of Ancient Aliens, right? I wouldn't say started with Eric Von Daniken, but he certainly like popularized that idea.
Yeah.
And so that's why like this book, you know, I had read it probably like 2 months before we started the show.
Oh, fascinating.
Yeah, because I kept hearing references to Eric Von Daniken, Chariots of the Gods. He's been on a bunch of podcasts that I've listened to. He's in Ancient Aliens, like the show.
Sure, yeah.
And I always kind of liked it. I like his presence. He's like really bombastic.
Yeah.
He's, I think, in his 80s now, but like he looks... he's like very presentable, like, and he's very, when you listen to him talk, like he's very engaging. He's really super into it.
So he's not the guy from the meme with the hair going everywhere, being like, it's always aliens.
No, but
this is like his button-down professor uncle that's like, it might be aliens and here's why.
That's exactly it. And I think that lends to some of his credibility, if you will. Mm-hmm. Now, I will say, if you read the book, or if you listen to him talk, his leaps of logic are such that the credibility factors in question. Okay. That being said, he puts together very clear, coherent sentences and like statements and ideas. And he doesn't like proselytize this stuff. Mm-hmm. So I like that.
Yeah.
He's, I wouldn't even say questioning like known history, but he is certainly... What I mean by that is like he's not like subverting other ideas. He's just saying, hey, look, this is crazy stuff. Let's talk about it. And I do like that approach.
Yeah. But he does also take it to the next level and say it is. Does he say it is aliens or does he say more likely than not?
He does something even more interesting, which is what he says. It's almost like, I wouldn't say how could it not be, but like what other explanation could there be?
Ah, yes.
Without saying it's aliens. It's just like, how could we have done this as humans 5,000 years ago?
Yeah, exactly.
So it's a good book. It's a very quick read. I want to say it's 200-ish pages. Mm-hmm. I think I sat down and read it in one reading. There's even pictures, which to me always helps.
100%, yeah.
They're old pictures, so, you know, not always super easy to see, but you can still Google this stuff and check it out. And we'll get to the criticism of the book later, and I think it kind of, you'll draw out the criticism yourself as we go through some of this stuff. But like, it's sold, according to the cover, over 7 million copies.
That's more books than I've sold.
Surprisingly.
I mean, it's at least a factor of 1 or 2 million more than I've sold.
Indeed.
Okay, so couple quick questions.
Yes.
When thereabouts was this written?
Yes, so this was actually published in 1968.
Oh, okay.
So very important to understand, like coming into this isn't like something that was written obviously 5 years ago, and it's like, Ancient Aliens, weird. This was kind of at the forefront of some of these ideas. He wasn't the first, but I think he was one of the first to popularize some of these ideas. And then, of course, what came after this later in the ensuing decades was TV shows like In Search of. Did you ever watch that, by the way?
No. What's that about?
They would look for ancient mysteries and stuff.
Ooh.
It was really good.
Okay.
It's like a mid-'80s kind of thing.
Oh, yeah, no. Definitely not.
Of course, Ancient Aliens. But then I think it spawned just a lot of people being very curious about and creating content about Ancient Aliens, mysteries of the world, all that kind of fun stuff.
Sure. Question number 2, without sounding jingoistic or anything like that, his name does have like an umlaut over the A and Eric is with a CH. Is he American? Is he not?
Yeah, I was going to break this down. So Eric Anton Paul von Daniken, born April 14th, 1935, is a Swiss born writer.
Well, he has credibility in my book for being Swiss.
You could be related as far as we know. You practically are related.
I think we might be. I want to also ask another quick question. Not that it helps necessarily. You can be a great reader, writer, everything else without having credentials. But does this man have letters after his name? Is he a doctor? Is he a PhD?
No, he worked in a hotel. So he doesn't have, let's just say, like hardcore, quote unquote, credentials for this.
He doesn't have the pedigree that generally comes with ancient alien hunting.
Correct.
Okay.
To be taken by the lamestream media, if you will.
Right. No, he's an inquisitive man who started to piece some things together, and he sold 7 million copies of a book. Good for him.
Exactly right. So I'm not going to put him down because of that. It's like he's laid out a bunch of stuff, but I will say, yes, there are some leaps of logic that are required.
Maybe not. I haven't heard all the facts.
Yeah, but it's his writing is compelling. It's very easy to read. He's a guy that uses a lot of exclamation points.
Love it.
Not usually like grouped together, but like there'll be one, and that's after the sentence of "How could it not be?" You know,
right. Yes.
What other explanation is there?
Man, you're selling me on this book.
It's worth a read. If you've got nothing to do on a Saturday morning, just read it. Okay, so talking a little bit further about Eric Von Daniken, this is his, obviously his most famous book, but he's written many others. And in fact, you might notice a theme amongst some of these titles. So he's written books such as The Gods Never Left Us, History's Wrong, Signs of the Gods, Evidence of the Gods, Gods from Outer Space. I mean, I can go on and on here, right?
Okay. Yep.
Now, here's where I'm a little confused because his work is largely categorized as pseudo-history and or pseudoscience. But, Timothy Jerome, I found this book in the nonfiction section of the library.
Thank you very much. Yes.
So I'm a little torn here.
Yeah. I think science and the quote-unquote big library hasn't quite caught up with the facts as Mr. Von Daniken has laid them out, I think.
So, yeah, clearly. They don't want you to know this stuff, but I'm surprised they didn't stash it in the fiction section. So this book, published in 1968. And so, now it's easy to look back and say, okay, some of these ideas now seem like old news. But, in fact, at the time that it was written, this is fairly, progressive. So let's talk about the title of the book, because I think the title really gives away the thesis of the book.
Okay.
Chariots of the Gods. And I actually think this is really super interesting, believe it or not. So I think, if you look back at history, there are hundreds, if not thousands of examples of aliens in recorded history. The issue is, Tim, they didn't have the syntax for them.
Yes.
Okay, so
I am all in. You could stop right here. I am all in.
So when we,
I am not even being ironic.
No, I know, and that to me is why this is actually a little bit compelling. So let's just say 5 to 10% of this stuff is believable. The broader theory is, hey, look, humans didn't have the vocabulary, the terminology, the syntax to say what is that being. Okay.
Yeah.
So when they say chariots of the gods, let's break that down. Chariots. What is that?
It's a vehicle.
It's a vehicle. Exactly. Why, Tim? Because they didn't have the word
flying saucer,
spaceships, right? All that stuff, right? What do you think gods could possibly represent?
Well, maybe aliens, perhaps.
Correct. So when he's the title of the book is a dead giveaway, which is basically since time immemorial, humans haven't had the words to actually describe what they were seeing, but in general did the best they could, and therefore chariots of the gods suggest they're spaceships.
I want to stop you right there. I want to ask a point that's I don't know. I'll just spit it out. Does he subscribe to the theory that these gods or these aliens are extraterrestrial? Or does he not say?
Yes.
Yes.
He does. Okay. He does. He doesn't necessarily say specifically they are aliens that visited from, the Greys, let's just say. He never goes down that path. And perhaps in 1968, that was too soon.
Okay.
But he does subscribe to the fact that these are from a different planet, let's just say.
Cool. Sure.
The other thing, too, is he never touches on any of the, ultra-terrestrial stuff.
Yep.
which also gets me thinking too, perhaps, and I forget which episode, Tim, you talked about, about the writer that believes in some of the ultra-terrestrial stuff.
Oh, yeah, well, that was John Keel. So, yeah, check out the Patreon page. Go to Crackpot Podcast. Sorry.
Patreon.com.
Go to patreon.com/Crackpot Podcast. You can find all sorts of episodes, but we did a really good one on the Mothman prophecies.
Yes.
And John Keel, the author of the Mothman prophecies, is of the belief, of the school of thought, that these quote-unquote aliens or men in black, or you could even go as far as like pixies and elves and fairies, have existed, and they are all one and the same, more or less. So they are not from a different planet. They're just part of our planet in some weird, hyper different dimension. So doesn't sound like we're going to go into that in a lot of detail, but I was just curious kind of where he fell on that.
Yeah, he seems
spectrum.
to be, and I guess, more traditional in the sense of like, these beings came down from outer space.
Cool.
That's what matters.
I'm okay with that.
So when you read the book, it's laid out in him going through, I guess I'd call them like mysteries of humanity, historical anomalies, and the premise here is like, how could humans have possibly done this without some form of intervention?
Sure. Okay.
And so he gets a little tiny bit into the science of it and then kind of backs off and then theorizes. So I think if I were to say, like, from a critical standpoint, what's wrong with this stuff, and he even says it himself, he says, I can't prove any of this.
Yeah.
However, let's talk about it.
Yeah. Perfect.
So let's start with where he really begins laying out his thesis here, and that is with the Bible.
Yeah.
With Genesis.
Yep.
And this is funny to me too, because as somebody who was brought up in a fairly religious household, I remember as a kid thinking about this and being very, very puzzled. And that is by how God refers to him or herself. Mm-hmm. God speaks in the plural.
Yes.
In Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, God says, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness."
Sure. Yeah.
That always freaked me out as a kid. And I was told, and I don't know what you were told, or if you were freaked out by that or not, but I was always told, that's just how they used to talk.
Yeah, that's a royal we. It's a grammatical phrasing, right? And without learning ancient Hebrew, it's hard to, counter that, I suppose.
No, but it is peculiar. And he also goes into Genesis pretty deep and even talks about some of the anomalies presented in Genesis, such as some references to giants in the Bible.
Yes, the giants of the land. Exactly.
Which he then ties across all these different indigenous texts and that kind of thing.
This is awesome.
It's actually really cool.
This is my jam,
exactly.
For sure.
In Genesis 6:4, it's stated, "There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, where the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. The same became mighty men which were old, men of renown." Mm-hmm. This, if you're going to say, okay, let's think about it from an ancient alien standpoint, suggests what? Interbreeding amongst perhaps some sort of divine or ancient aliens or something that isn't really terrestrial, shall we say.
Right. I have heard that explained like the giants of man are actually people finding elephant skulls, because an elephant skull is enormous. Instead of two eye sockets, it's actually like one large eye socket. And they're like, oh, maybe it's a giant cyclops or something like that. And I've also heard the alien idea, probably through him, but not, directly from him. And I don't know. It's fascinating because there it is. It's in the first book. It's hard to ignore. It's the widest published book in the history. So what do they mean by that?
Well, and it's so literal too. It's like you cannot ignore.
Yeah.
Speaking in the plural, talking about giants. It's like, okay, that's awfully peculiar.
Yeah. So from a biblical standpoint, perhaps it's, the angels in heaven or something like that, that came down and, I guess, procreated with humankind or something like that. But again, that opens up a whole nother interesting subset of questions, which I'm sure we won't get into in this episode, but it's odd. It's really weird.
Well, and he even talks about some of the visitations, which in the Bible sound like angels, to your point, but in fact could be alien visitations, shall we say.
Yeah.
He brings up this text of a visitation by Ezekiel in the Bible. I won't read the whole thing. It's kind of confusing.
Is this the one where he wrestled with the angel? I can't remember if that's Ezekiel or not.
I don't think that's the one. But he talked about this, and I'm quoting here. "And I looked, and behold, a whirlwind came out of the north, a great cloud and a fire infolding itself, and a brightness was about it. Out of the midst of the fire, also out of the midst thereof, came the likeness of 4 living creatures, and this was their appearance. They had the likeness of a man, and every one had 4 faces, and every one had 4 wings." First of all, that's creepy sounding.
Oh, it's insane. It is just like, to try to picture that, it's not some sort of Renaissance depiction of, a white guy with wings and long hair. Like that sounds scary.
That's like a totally different creature.
You're right.
Now, the other thing too, and the text of the Bible, because it's obviously an older style of writing, gets a little bit confusing, but then Ezekiel kind of lays out what this craft might look like, and then talks about how when the living creatures went, the wheels went by them, and when the living creatures were lifted up from the earth, the wheels went with them, suggesting they came down in a craft and left in a craft.
Wheels within wheels. It's so bizarre. Yeah.
So bizarre.
Yeah, flaming chariots. Like, what else could that be other than aliens, obviously, or divine intervention of some sort?
I was going to say, yeah. So I think if you ask a biblical scholar, they're going to say angels. If you talk to somebody else, either a mystery or perhaps ancient aliens visiting Earth.
So now, okay, to really kind of play this out, if this was, God with a capital G, sending down angels or other heavenly beings, right? And if they truly looked different than humankind, right? These people had never seen anything like that. You and I have never seen anything like that. Thankfully. It's like, how do you use your words to describe what you see? You know
what this reminds me of, Tim? This reminds me of Bob Lazar. And we covered Bob Lazar, Area 51S4, whatever you want to call it. And when he's talking about some of the crafts and some of the technology that he observed, he doesn't have words for it. He says, it's like this, or it reminds you of that. Yes. But it's not XYZ, right?
That's super fascinating. That's a really good point. I mean, if you take him at his word, which for the sake of argument, let's just do that. He was looking at an extraterrestrial, a out of this world craft, something that had no frame of reference to anything, whether it was the material it was made of, or the way it flew, or just, as he was trying to describe, the stuff on the inside. I remember he was super fascinating when he saw like 3 chairs, and like the way the compartment opened and closed was like some sort of mesh thing. And he's like, okay, I get that. Like, I understand how that tiny little insignificant thing works. And I'm just going to start there, because he didn't have the words. He didn't have the comprehension. It was so outside of the realm of any bit of understanding. And he's a pretty smart guy by all accounts.
Well, what's the analogy that he used? It was the dropping the motorcycle off in the wagon wheel times, right? It's like, humans 150 years ago or something, if you gave them a motorcycle, they could look at it and they could kind of figure out maybe how it was used or what it was used for. Yeah. They wouldn't have any of the terminology. They might be able to figure out how to turn it on and drive it, a little ways,
maybe,
but that's all they would know. But they would have no context for what this thing was.
Exactly.
And that was only 150 years ago. So super interesting. So what I'll say about the way the book is constructed is Von Daniken goes, what's the old expression, like a mile wide, an inch deep.
Yeah.
So he doesn't go super deep into some of these theories. He kind of moves right along and says, these are all historical anomalies. Let's just talk about them, right? So the next thing that he brings up is the Epic of Gilgamesh.
Oh, fascinating.
One of my favorite, I can't call it a book, but writings.
It's one of your favorite epic poems.
Yeah. It really is. Technically true. Have you read it?
I'm sure I read part of it in some English class at one point, but
I remember reading it, in, I want to say, junior year of college, and it's very hard to read.
Yeah.
You can glean probably more from the Wikipedia page than actually reading the text, because it's just old Sumerian, babble. It's like, what does this even mean?
Exactly. Yeah.
But the story is very interesting.
Isn't the story just kind of an allegory or a story?
I'll summarize it in one sentence.
Please.
Okay, so you have Gilgamesh, who goes on this epic journey to find his best friend after his friend died, and also eternal life.
Okay.
But it's this crazy story about this king who was, get this, 2/3 God, 1/3 human.
Oh, okay.
Who had, all of these powers.
Sure.
And ultimately tried to see God and find eternal life.
I mean, how long ago? Well, I don't even have a frame of reference when this was written.
I will say it is the oldest surviving epic, dating back to about 2100 BCE.
Okay. I mean, to me, that sounds a lot like the literary style you would use if you were writing a Marvel comic book movie,
Absolutely.
So,
it's the hero's journey.
It's the hero's journey, 100%.
Yeah.
Like, probably quite literally, it is the hero's journey. But like the idea of a 2/3 God, 1/3 man, or whatever ratio it was, that's like a superhero. So, I mean, I'm already poking holes in it. I'm sorry, I haven't even heard his argument yet, but it just sounds like literary-ness.
In other words, they're using their imagination to write a very interesting story, an entertaining story.
An entertaining story.
What I think Von Daniken might say is, this is how the humans understood the world around them, and perhaps they borrowed from some imagination or perhaps literary techniques. That being said, the idea of a 2/3 God, 1/3 human, thing or creature, that's not drawing upon any form of imagination. That's proof of...
Okay.
Intermixing or interbreeding amongst humans and aliens.
Okay.
And what I like to say is he goes, Von Daniken will lay out 1, 2, 3 and jump to 6.
Yeah.
He'll just kind of
4, 5, and 6 are pretty obvious. I don't need to talk about them.
I think a pretty good example of this is when Gilgamesh is basically leaving Earth and going to be traveling through space.
Yeah.
Hanging from the talons of a bird, which of course has to be a spaceship.
Obviously.
So one of the characters, Enkidu, is talking about what he's seeing as he's flying over the Earth with Gilgamesh. He said to me, and it says, he said to me, "Look down at the land. What does it look like? Look at the sea. How does it seem to you? The land was like a mountain and the sea was like a lake." And again, he flew for 4 hours and he said to me, "Look down at the land. What does it look like? Look at the sea. How does it seem to you? And the earth was like a garden and the sea was like a water channel of a gardener." And he flew higher yet another 4 hours and spake, "Look down at the land. What does it look like? Look at the sea. How does it seem to you? And the land looked like porridge and the sea looked like water through a trough." And this is where Von Daniken just goes right to 6. And what he says is, in this case, some living creature must have seen the earth from a great height. The account is too accurate to have been the product of pure imagination. Who could have possibly said that the land looked like porridge and that the sea like water through?
Who could have imagined?
I mean, you get the idea. So he goes, okay, here's what it is. Therefore, how could it be anything else?
I like the way his mind thinks. Maybe it's just the sucker podcast host in me, but I like that. I like making the leap that way. But that being said, no, it literally just sounds like a creative author. You don't have to have airplanes or be up in the sky to imagine what things might look like from a different perspective. That is...
Oh, absolutely.
That is humanness 101.
I remember as a kid at my grandparents' house, laying in the yard, looking up at the trees from the grass and thinking, I wonder what that looks like from the other side. Right. So I don't think...
Were you abducted by aliens as a child?
There's some missing time. I seem to remember an owl in there somewhere too. And so, in keeping with his style, that's about as far as he goes.
Okay.
And it's okay, this is weird. Now, the Epic of Gilgamesh is truly an epic, and there are battles and there's gods and you can't see God, and there are a lot of parallels with the Bible. There was reference to a historic flood and all this kind of stuff. It's super interesting, but I think the points that I'm trying to make here is that Von Daniken looks back at some of these old texts and says, well, what other explanation could there be?
What else could it possibly be?
Now, fast forward a little tiny bit. This one I find actually slightly more compelling than the Epic of Gilgamesh. So, okay. Got to believe it then.
Right. Go from a 0.2 to a 3. Okay.
Are you familiar with the Indian text, a Mahabharata?
I don't know. Maybe. Probably not.
Okay, this one actually is really super cool. So this is one of the two ancient Sanskrit texts originating from ancient India. It was written and compiled between 3000 BCE and 300 BCE. So quite old.
That's pretty cool.
Now, this one is really interesting because there are no bones about the fact that in this text, there are references to and explanations of flying craft.
Go on.
And where Von Daniken goes to 6 is when he says that this also describes this text also describes the first instance of an atomic weapon.
Oh, baby. Okay, you had my attention at aliens, but now...
And I will say, kind of weird. Just let's approach this with some curiosity, okay?
Sure.
So,
what's the name of the text again?
Mahabharata.
Okay.
And in fact, if you watch the show Ancient Aliens, they cover this on a couple of episodes because there's a lot to it. I mean, this is a huge thing, and there's even some depictions and murals and pieces of artwork in which they appear to be like chariots in the sky or some sort of crafts in the sky, and these gods raining fire upon humanity from them.
Nice.
So, reading directly from the Mahabharata, Bhima flew with his Vimana on an enormous ray, which was as brilliant as the sun and made a noise like the thunder of a storm.
Ooh, yeah.
So he described the craft in pretty great detail. But then he goes in to describe what Von Daniken's interpretation here is of like an H-bomb or perhaps an atomic weapon. And I'm quoting Von Daniken here. He says, he describes a weapon, and of course this is talking about the Mahabharata, that could kill all warriors who wore metal on their bodies. If the warriors learned about the effect of this weapon in time, they tore off all the metal equipment they were wearing, jumped into a river, and washed themselves and everything that they had come into contact with very thoroughly. Not without reason, as the author explains, for the weapon made the hair and the nails fall out. Everything living, he bemoaned, became pale and weak.
Yeah, that sounds like radiation poisoning.
That sounds exactly like radiation poisoning. So you've got...
I feel like that's not that much of a leap.
No, it's not. That's not that much of a leap. I mean, is it a leap to say they were dropping atomic bombs and or H-bombs? Like, yeah, but it does sound very similar.
And that was written when, again? They compiled it,
3000 BC to 300 BC?
Sure. So, like, how do you explain that pre-1940,
Oh, very good point.
Like, what was the explanation? It's like, oh, that's a really weird... weapon of the gods, I guess. Huh.
I suppose it's just this idea that like the gods can do such horrible things to humanity that, can penetrate your armor. It'll make your hair fall out.
Okay, well, that's interesting. Yeah, it's like, what would be a very dangerous and scary weapon back then? Well, I mean, even if you're wearing armor, it can get you. What would make it just absolutely devastating to everyone and everything? Well, if it killed living things, if it killed the hair on your body and the skin on your muscles and bones. That being said, it really does sound like radiation poisoning.
It does. So Von Daniken goes, hey, look, they're talking about these crafts that are flying around that look like beams of light and make these noises that sound like thunder, which to me sounds like, a jet propulsion engine, right?
Sure.
And then on top of that, they're dropping these bombs or something that is having effects very, very similar to radiation poisoning.
I wish I knew more about the after effects of atomic weapons.
Sure.
But if we said this happened in this region in the Indian subcontinent, could you then theoretically go back and trace radioactive amounts? And I'm certain, based on what you've told me so far, that Mr. Von Daniken has not done that. But
well, they say that's a very good point, right? Which is they can find samples in the soil of, the early, American weapons programs.
Sure, but that wasn't even 100 years ago.
Correct.
So I'm saying, well, if I legitimately do not know, but it would be fascinating if those effects could still be felt now or detected now, could you?
I would. Well, what's the half-life of uranium? Like
that's the question.
Bajillion years, which is why they're all in Yucca Mountain, right?
Well, fair enough.
So I would assume 3,000-4,000 years ago they should probably be able to detect it. But anyways, that was very interesting. And in fact, like I said, Ancient Aliens does a whole deep dive on this specific topic. This book doesn't.
Okay.
It's just kind of like
it brings it up like, wow, this is really weird.
Yeah.
This is how I would describe it. Yeah.
100%. And so, I apologize. It probably feels like I'm kind of going like fast forward through some of these like different like examples, but that's exactly how the book is written.
I mean, I thought it would all be just different architecture and stuff like that. That's really interesting that he brought in some of those just ancient literary references.
That to me was a great start, actually.
Yeah.
Because then he does go into some of the architecture. And I think like all good mysteries, you got to talk about Egypt. You got to talk about the pyramids.
Yes. Of course.
One of the first things that it brings up, and I got to take him at his word for it, but apparently this civilization of the ancient Egyptians just kind of appears out of nowhere. Not a ton of prehistory to them.
I just don't know enough to say anything intelligent about that. So I'm all right. I'll take him at his word.
And then, of course, he goes into the engineering required to complete the construction of the pyramids still is largely incomprehensible. I mean, like, we have different theories. I don't think we have one that every single, archaeologist agrees upon.
Yeah.
But he brings up some points that I think are interesting because what he's saying here is like, look, humans really couldn't have done this. One being there's not enough timber in the area to support the rolling of the giant blocks, right? That's kind of being one. Another one is in the area there's not enough food, agriculture to support the number of workers required, right?
Okay.
And then also he talks about, of course, just how precise, right? So each block, 30 tons or something, but everything fits and is measured to within half of an inch, or I think maybe it's a quarter of an inch. It's like, with the technology they had at that time, it doesn't seem like it's even possible or explainable, right?
Yeah.
But I think what gets more interesting is when he starts talking about some of the, should we say, coincidences or whatever. He talks about how the Egyptians worshipped the sun god Ra. And what's really interesting is that the sun god Ra traveled through the heavens in a bark, which is like a boat, right?
Okay.
And what's even more interesting is the fact that the height of the Pyramid of Cheops multiplied by 1,000 million, 98 million miles, corresponds approximately to the distance between the Earth and the sun.
Not bad.
So,
not bad.
Point number A, how could the ancient Egyptians have measured the distance from the sun to the Earth? Okay.
Sure. Okay.
And then on top of that, build something that corresponds, to scale, right?
Okay.
That also represents that. I mean, could they have done this thousands of years ago?
Or could that have just been facts that they sort of back engineered? And it's like, hey, if we take the height of this, and multiply it by a really big number, it gets really close to the distance, the Earth to the sun. Also, look, it's on it's elliptical. It's not a pure circle. So you got a pretty big window to play with.
Yeah.
Also, I mean, the underlying current, and I hate to be PC about this, but it's when it comes to saying that these ancient artifacts and buildings and monuments were all built by aliens because there's no way humans could have done it. There is an underlying thought that's like, well, geez, brown people certainly couldn't have done it. Therefore, aliens.
Sure. Absolutely.
And it is for as much as I love to talk about aliens, and find the clues wherever I can. Probably don't think that the pyramids were built by aliens. I just don't. I mean, there are, like you said, theories about how they built it. And, the timber, it's like, well, do we know what the exact agriculture, do we know what the trees were at the time? I mean, maybe they weren't rolling the stones down. Maybe they were using flooded canals. Like, we don't know. We can hypothesize, but there's ways they could have done it. Would it have been difficult? Yeah. Would it have required a lot of time and effort and people, absolutely. But it could have been done.
It could have been done. And in fact, they have theories around how it was done, right? But the thought is, why? What's the point?
A monument to an egotistical narcissist, I suppose. But.
Of which they always say, hey, look, usually the person that, instructed this thing to be built or commanded it to be built didn't even see the completion of it.
Yeah.
Which is interesting in and of itself. He also talks about when it comes to, ancient Egypt and some of these ancient cultures, there's this obsession with eternal life, with what happens after death, and with specifically mummification. Mm-hmm. And so the idea is, after death, you get transported somewhere else and you take everything with you, and you have this mummified body that you re-inhabit elsewhere. And he goes in different examples across China, and I think in the Arctic regions where there's some of those, bodies are still preserved, basically, but just saying, like, there seemed to have been this theme across these ancient cultures in which not only is there this obsession with these gods, but then also trying to be with them once again, which can be achieved through mummification. Where did humans get this knowledge from? It's really hard to understand.
Okay. And also, a lot of those ideas about an afterlife and maybe not taking stuff with you per se, but preservation of bodies and so on and so forth, that's still very common in a lot of cultures in modern day times.
Couldn't agree more. Exactly right.
So, I mean, on the flip side of that coin, you could say that maybe those are traditions passed down that we got from, aliens a couple thousand years ago. Or it's just human nature to believe that after we die, there's another better place and we'll all meet up again in, the great beyond.
It is the greatest mystery of all. Carrying on. Let's talk about Easter Island.
Oh, I like that. Okay.
Easter Island's pretty creepy. Similar to ancient Egypt, you gotta cover Easter Island whenever you talk aliens, whenever you talk old mysteries, right? What I didn't realize before I read this was actually, like, when the first missionaries landed on Easter Island, they burned many of the ancient texts that actually described, like, how this stuff was made and what the purpose was.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Really?
So we were that close.
Jesus.
That close.
All the alien proof was right there, and they just burnt
there.
it.
All that's left are these giant 30 to 50 ton carved from this lava rock structures, 33 to 66 feet high. Big heads.
Yeah.
Big eyes. Just
there's bodies underneath the ground, though, too.
Okay. I believe that. Alien bodies or human?
Yeah. I mean, long appendages, just...
Yeah, just so. Well, tell me, okay, so, real quick, just in case you don't know, Easter Island, it's a desolate island about 2,500 miles west of Chile. And on it, there are hundreds of statues, as I said, between 36 and 66 feet tall, each weighing 50 tons approximately, dating back approximately to 400 CE. So not that old.
Yes, still kind of old, but
so real quick, I mean, I kind of laid out what they look like, but just based on what your understanding is, what do they
look like? Just look like giant heads.
Mm-hmm. Do they look like Homo sapien heads?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Big, I'm trying to think in my mind without looking up a picture.
You think they look like human heads? Like
I do think, up? Well, I mean, they're not, like European features necessarily, but they do, 2 eyes, a nose, and a mouth.
Okay,
yeah.
Fair enough. But their features are not. Yeah.
If I saw someone walking down the street that had the same exact head shape as an Easter Island, head, they would catch my attention.
And especially if there are 50 tons and...
Yeah, well, that too. Yeah, right.
Exactly. So when Von Daniken talks about, what the European missionaries saw when they first landed on Easter Island, and as I mentioned before, they burned some of the texts and they got rid of basically that indigenous culture. But they couldn't stop the locals from referring to their land or their island as the land of the birdmen. Orally transmitted legend tells us that flying men landed and lighted fires in ancient times, and that the legend is confirmed by sculptures of flying creatures with big staring eyes. So in other words, birdmen landed on the island, and now we have these sculptures that look apparently like them.
Oh. Okay, that's interesting.
That's very interesting. Now, this is where Von Daniken goes to 6 once again, and he says, and I'll show you a picture in a sec. He says, hey, look, isn't it odd that these sculptures on Easter Island also very specifically resemble some of these sculptures in Latin America, in Bolivia, at the site of Tijuanaco? Let me just show you, Tim, quickly a picture of some of these beings, or these, I don't know, people, whatever, aliens.
Birdmen?
Yeah, on Tijuanaco in Latin America, by the way, some 3,000 plus miles away.
Those look surprisingly similar. That's interesting because, I mean, they're separated by an ocean.
Yeah.
Very odd.
Very, very odd. And this is also where it gets even a little bit more odd as well. And that is when Von Daniken's talking about when the Spanish conquistadors landed in South and Central America, and they're seeing these structures and they're, finding these relics. And they keep hearing about these stories of the sagas of Viracocha. Mm-hmm. What were these sagas about? They were about gigantic white men who came from somewhere in the sky. They learned about a race of sons of the sun who instructed mankind in all kinds of arts and disappeared again. And in all the legends that the Spaniards heard, there was an assurance that the sons of the sun would return.
Wow. I love that.
Yeah, which, I don't want to talk about Christopher Columbus because obviously he did a ton of not great stuff, really, really, really bad stuff. But, what you hear about is when he landed, or when the conquistadors landed in South and Central America, they were more or less welcomed because the theory was,
yes,
they're going to come back, right? These white people are coming back.
Exactly. Wow, that is so fascinating, though.
It is. So I think if you just say, hey, wait a sec, let's not talk about Eric Von Daniken. Let's not talk about this specific thesis of the book. It's just interesting.
It is incredibly interesting. And it's almost it's almost unfortunate that we're talking about it through the lens as much as we want to disassociate ourselves from him and from this book, because anyway.
Yeah.
But the idea of these gods from the sky that, came down once, gave us our arts, gave us our language, gave us our culture, then they left and they'll come back. I mean, with the Easter Island thing, you and I probably don't know. I don't know how they got there, but, probably boats a long time ago, and they landed on this island. But, what came and went from the island? Birds, right?
There you go.
Probably not a lot else. So maybe there was some sort of deification of these birds, and then the myth, the legend, the stories grew, and they're like bird men, bird gods, bird god men, and so on and so forth. But the idea, back to the original part of my rant, that this culture came from the heavens. I mean, even if you look at the biblical Judeo-Christian story, it's kind of the same, without offending too many people. It's this idea that, culture, language, life came from the sky, came from the heavens.
So I'm going to show you, and I'm going to go a little bit further into Mayan culture, actually, because this is where, again, a similar civilization to the ancient Egyptians showed up apparently out of nowhere, had this incredible understanding of mathematics, science, astronomy.
Yeah.
The calendar is still like the most accurate calendar that was created by humans.
Yeah.
It's incredible. And so Von Daniken posits, how else could this be, or how else could this have been done?
Right.
Which, to your broader point earlier, maybe that's not the right question to ask, but it's a mystery nonetheless. I'm going to show you a picture directly from this book. I'm not going to give you any context to this, because I really don't want you to have any bias here.
Yeah.
And I want you to tell me what you see in this Mayan relic, okay?
Yes. Okay, so I have seen that picture before, and I believe I know the context of which I'm pretty darn sure I know the context of what he's bringing it up. Nevertheless, it's basically an indigenous person, probably of the culture, laying on his back, more or less, and there's a lot of ornate stuff around him. He's looking up more, or I can't see it anymore, but yeah. I mean, he's looking up. There's all sorts of, decorations and ornate, cool-looking things. The context of which I saw that picture, they said that it was clearly someone inside of a spaceship.
Yes.
And I don't know where you feel about this. I saw that. Yeah, I was reading a book. I quick, grabbed my phone, looked up on Google, and I was like, maybe. I don't see it, but I guess I could see how maybe someone might, kind of.
No, exactly. So when I first read this book and Von Daniken laid this out, I'm like, I don't see it. But his writing is so fantastical. Listen to this. This is what he says. Yeah. He says, this drawing was made in the temple at Copan. Could primitive imagination have produced anything so remarkably similar to a modern astronaut in his rocket? The strange markings at the foot of the drawing can only be an indication of the flames and gases coming from the propulsion unit.
To which I vehemently disagree.
Yeah.
A rocket is it's a lot of straight lines. Okay. It's a lot of very straight lines. And, the rocket propulsion, while they may not understand the physics behind it, they've seen fire. That doesn't look like fire necessarily.
No, it doesn't. And I think when you look at this picture, it just appears to be a lot of like embellishments and flourishes. And it's in that classic kind of Mayan, art, right? That style where there's a lot, like to your point, there's not a lot of straight lines. And so it's interesting to look at, but like if nobody told you, if you'd seen this for the first time and never was told that it was supposedly an alien craft or something, or a spaceship,
right?
That wouldn't be the first thing that comes to mind.
That would not be the first thing I would think of.
And that's how the book is, right? Okay, so it's like, you read these things and these are these historical anomalies and they're super interesting and they're really fun to talk about. There is zero proof of any of this stuff except for him saying, what else could it be?
Yeah, which I respect the hell out of. I truly do. Like, I love that idea. I love that idea of finding a mystery and just being like, well, clearly, clearly it's this. And I mean, hey, look, we don't, I mean, maybe there's an explanation. Maybe there's some Mayan archaeologist or historian that can tell us exactly what that means. But, I think it might be as good of a guess as any. I wouldn't hang my hat on it. I wouldn't put it in writing, but I'd be like, well, maybe it's a spaceship. Maybe he's in his bed, and that's like all the flowers hanging around the room or something.
Right. That's exactly it. So, I mean, we started this conversation by saying, hey, look, humans didn't have, thousands of years ago, the syntax, like the language to talk about this stuff. Similarly, maybe they didn't have even the artistic ability to recreate what they were seeing. So, if I saw some interdimensional craft right now, well, first of all, I can barely draw. But I would probably not do it any justice. And it might not come out anything like what that craft really looks like.
Sure.
But it's a rough interpretation, right?
Sure.
So that is Chariots of the Gods.
I like it.
I do too.
And I really don't like it,
Well, and the thing is, the book really finishes on him talking about the future of humans traveling through space and some of these, kind of almost like science fiction type ideas. But I think what I do like about it is that he's questioning the historical record, and he's just saying, hey, look at this stuff. This is just strange.
Yeah.
I don't always agree when he jumps to 6, but I like it when sometimes he goes 1, 2, 3. Well, what's up with 4, 5?
Yeah. No, 100%.
Yeah. Now, this book, not without its criticism.
Oh, okay.
So let's talk about that quickly.
What are the other people saying?
Well, one of our mutually favorite people wrote the foreword to one of his books, The Space Gods Revealed, Carl Sagan.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. He said, and I quote,
really?
Oh, yeah. This is so great. The writing is careless as Von Daniken's, whose principal thesis is that our ancestors were dummies, should be so popular in a sober commentary on the credulousness and despair of our times. I also hope for the continuing popularity of books like Chariots of the Gods in high school and college logic courses, adds object lessons and sloppy thinking. I know of no recent books so riddled with logical and factual errors as the works of Von Daniken.
Wait, he put that in the foreword?
That was in the foreword.
That's amazing. The publisher calls her. It's like, we got Carl Sagan. He agreed to write the foreword. It's like, print it. I don't even want to read it.
Good news, bad news.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and so, I mean, okay, obviously very, very critical of what Von Daniken says. And it doesn't take a genius to look at this stuff and say, okay, he's making a lot of leaps here. But that being said, like, again, the idea, I think, is super, super fascinating. You know, one of the other critiques of Von Daniken is that he wrote this book after he was, so while he was on trial for fraud and embezzlement, and he used some of that money from the proceeds of the book then to pay off his legal fees, spent a little bit of time in jail.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Was it at all?
Basically what it was, from what I understood, was, and this is when he was like 20, so we'll give him a little bit of a little slack there. He was borrowing money to travel the world to then look at some of these historical sites. And I think that's where the fraud came in, was he wasn't always doing that. And I think what they said was he was living like an international playboy, something to that effect.
You know what? Give him a slap on the wrist.
He served like a year in jail, and they let him out on good behavior, whatever. And then he worked in the hotel business and wrote more and more books, and then got famous, and the rest is, well, shall we say, history.
Oh,
but
that's really fascinating. That's
funny.
I
don't want to like that's fine. We all have our crazy 20s or whatever. But anyways, you could say, look, maybe he wrote this to make money to pay off his legal fees, and then just kind of kept going to get more popular.
Well, in order to sell more copies, we're going to make it a little more interesting, jump to a few bigger conclusions.
Yes. But I like the book, and if you want to read it, go ahead. It's a very quick read. It's interesting. I mean, I wish in some of these cases they went deeper on this stuff, because it's just, and also some of the chapters jump around, so you have to kind of like really figure out, okay, what's he asserting here through all these different, leaps of logic. But it's still good. It's still interesting.
That's wild. I'm putting that on my list, man. That is a good one. Thank you for bringing that up. I mean, like you said, at its core, there's a lot of fascinating stuff. Maybe some of them are aliens. Who knows?
What I'm hearing you say, Tim, is you're all in.
I'm pretty much almost absolutely all the way in.
Nailed it.
All right, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in this week. Fun little deep dive. Thank you. Chariots of the Gods. Check it out at your local library and or book selling conglomerate. I will say, I've checked this book out twice, and they're available in just about every single library in the county. Yeah. And in most cases, half of them are checked out. I am serious. I love it. That's great. Yeah. So keep people reading. Nothing wrong with that. Exactly. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for tuning in. If you haven't already, rate, review, hit a like button if you see it. Tell your friends, tell your neighbors, tell your local archaeologists about our podcast. We'll see you next week. Thanks, everybody.